We're beginning now content that explores the personality through a framework of a humanistic and existential perspective. It really has a great philosophical bent that is not as pronounced or prevalent in some of the other perspectives that we've studied. It has a great deal of respect for the individual as an autonomous thinking being, and that the individual choices that one makes cause the personality to evolve, like that we are constantly evolving, growing beings with goals that are ultimately spiritual in nature, and that we walk through this path of life developing and winding our way toward those goals. So it rejects a little bit of the idea that personality is structured and stable. We have predispositions, but it offers us great possibility for change. And this little Snoopy image on the left is just exploring the existential framework about this perspective, which is sort of this questioning of why we are here. And so to put this in the perspective of where we've come from, we started with our psychoanalytic theories, looking mostly at Freud and the role of libido in driving our systematic behaviors. We then looked at neo-analytic theories, which suggests that our behaviors are created by drives, search for identity in the social world. Biological theories suggest that personality is shaped by biology and genes. Behavioral theories are looking at the aspects of personality created by reinforcers and punishers in our environment. Cognitive theories suggest that personalities are shaped by the way we perceive the world and think about the world. Trait theories just simply views personality as a function of traits. And our humanistic theories then created that our personality evolves in time and is created by the search for meaning and self-actualization. So we might consider, as a way of just thinking about this existential framework, that you're at a turning point in your life. You're at the edge of a cliff and you need to take a new direction. And what would this direction be? Where would you go? What would you be seeking? So we might want to think about this as a framework for the kind of change that is possible within a being. If your world is, if the foundation on which you stand is yanked out from under you, and there you are without that foundation, what are your goals? What do you seek? Where do you go? What do you do? So we can think of four sort of philosophical approaches to this problem, and one is idealism. And idealists believe in this search for truth on the spiritual and physical plane. And so in such a situation, they might recommend to an individual to pursue a spiritual goal, even if that compromises physical security. So that idealist suggestion, as they search for truth, is really that spiritual growth is the most. Realists, we can think of these also as maybe materialists, believe only in the physical world. They think that if there's no tangible physical evidence, then it's not exist. We shouldn't be talking or thinking about it. And so they would probably recommend a disciplined direction that allows continued exploration and residence in just this material world, just which is known through our primary five senses. A pragmatic view would suggest that there is no eternal truth. So if there's nothing eternal, then we can take a path that produces the best consequences relative to the current situation, the current desires or needs. And existentialists, which is probably most aligned with this perspective, suggest that ultimate freedom of the individual to choose is a primary belief that existentialists have. And so they might recommend that whatever choice you make, wherever you find yourself going, you do it intentionally and responsibly, with contemplation and full acceptance of the consequences. So in other words, a sort of mindfulness in action, that if you make a choice, then you commit to that choice and you accept whatever emerges from that choice. And so there's a lot of responsibility of the individual to shape their path in life. So humanist approaches to personality, who are we, rest within this existentialist framework that we make our choices. So what is existentialism? Existentialism is a philosophy suggesting that an individual's experience is unique and isolated within a hostile or indifferent universe. So it begins perhaps at a point in time that we described in that cliff slide, which is this feeling of disorientation or confusion in life. Something's been yanked out from under you. This may be a point when you're young and you first leave your home. That could be a point of disorientation. Or it might be a point when something dramatic and possibly very painful happens, the loss of someone very important to you, or perhaps the loss of like your career or something like that. But something has caused your foundation to be removed. And so now all of a sudden, rather than being one who knows exactly and can predict what's happening, a person becomes one who doesn't know, one who is lost. And this lostness leads to recognition of one's own power, individual empowerment. At that situation, you have to find a different meaning. You have to give your life meaning. Otherwise, you suffer alienation and despair. And so if you're able to get through that and give yourself meaning, then that's an empowering factor. And in doing so, you have to embrace your complete individual experience, all the emotions and all the thoughts and even sensations like physical pain. You have to embrace it, because if you reject it or fight it, it's a losing battle. And so then the individual has to shape his or her own life. You have to create the things that happen to you. A friend of mine said to me, a friend from Japan said that his belief was we are all born alone and will die alone. And so within that, our own choices and responsibilities for our own lives happen within that space. We're born alone, we die alone, and we're responsible for what happens in between. And so an individual has freedom of choice and has responsibility for the consequences of those choices. So once we're in that situation of having to make this choice, we have a crisis. Going on to this next bullet. We have a crisis, and it comes with a lot of anxiety, because we have a fear of this void. Like, if we leave our known familiar structure, what is there? There's no longer any structure to guide us. And that's a lot of freedom. No constraints, no structures, no laws. That's an empty space. And for our comfortable physical being in this world, that's very uncomfortable. And so sometimes we might just get ourselves right back into another routine in order to avoid the discomfort of this void. And so the general principles of this existentialist philosophy is non-positivist, and what this means is that there's a denial of the existence of natural laws. Like, there's the denial of the existence that there's one unchanging human nature, or that there are absolute things that are known and true that guide us. So it leaves a lot of openness for exploration, and it's non-deterministic. And by determinism means that things are like preordained, that our path has already been laid out and we're just following it. Rather, they suggest that all in any moment is in one's control. You can't blame anything that you choose within that moment on id, on your primitive drives, or on society. It's you who make the choice, irrespective of your inner drives and irrespective of the world around you. Or to put all this a little more succinctly, we have no predetermined nature or essence that controls who we are, what we do, or what's valuable for us. So we know that we have certain traits, introversion, extroversion, but within those traits, those things that push us or impel us, our personalities, we can still make choices of whether to accede to those impulses or not. So nothing determines what we're doing. We're radically free to act independently of determination by outside influences. We can resist even the strongest inner drive. We can choose not to eat even when we're starving. And so that's what we're getting at. So by making our choices, we create our own human nature. So there's a lot of will involved. And we create our values through these choices. So a lot of individual responsibility. So there are some ideas of existentialism that are not true to its original thinking or philosophy. Existentialism is not hedonistic. Hedonism is the belief that wealth, pleasure, or honor make good life. And existentialists don't accept this. I often think of hedonism as a drive toward pleasure as the primary motivation in our action. The seeking of pleasure, the doing what feels good to us, irrespective of the impact to others, and like soothing of our senses, like gratifying our desires. And that is not aligned with with existentialist philosophy. Existentialism is not dependent on norms, and norms are the societal expectations or behaviors that might guide decisions or behaviors. So there might be a norm of how you should progress through your life. Like you come of a certain age, you get a certain type of job, you marry at a certain point in life, you have children at a certain point in life. You make decisions for how you manage your day and when you eat your meals. Those are all norms. They're not rules, they're not guidelines, they're not essential to life. Existentialists don't believe that we have to follow those norms. We don't have the right to violate others, but on the other hand, within our own lives, we can choose to have a meal at a certain time or not to have a meal. We can choose to follow the times at which decisions are made. We don't have to depend on those norms. Existentialists are not fatalist. Fatalism accepts what is and declares that it is enough in life. So you kind of just give up and say, this is what is. Existentialists do not agree with fatalism, but seek the greater good. So it's actively striving to improve rather than just saying, this is as good as I can do. Existentialism is not naive. Existentialists don't believe that people are basically good but ruined by society, but rather they believe that people shape their values. We shape our own values. And so people might be good, but people might also follow pathways that lead them to not be following the right path, but shaped by the individual. And finally, existentialism is not selfish. Existentialists do not adopt a self-serving, I want my way now, or it is not my fault mentality, but accept full responsibility for their choices and roles within society. I think of this idea of freedom as one that was a bit freeing to me, having been raised in a rather rigid kind of Christian upbringing, but not a beautiful aspect of Christianity, but more of a negative one that was based a lot on punishment. And I felt a little free just listening to this old John Lennon song that allowed me to imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. I could feel my heart lifting just imagining that freedom from that societal constraint that had been placed on me. Imagine all the people living for today, just being in the moment, being present. Imagine there's no countries. I guess that might go along with no clans. You know, it isn't hard to do, but nothing to kill or die for. and no religion too. That song freed me a bit. And when I think the song is talking about religion, or when existentialists think about religion, they're not rejecting spiritual, the beauty of that inner space, or spiritual beliefs, or experiences that lead an individual to know God. And perhaps during ceremony, that knowing comes about as part of the Navajo tradition. That's not what's rejected. What's rejected are the dogmatic constraints, like the constraints of Christianity that led people who are Christian to think that they should convert people who are Navajo. That's the thing that they're talking about, that structured religion that imposes itself on others. We can think of personality in ancient India as being a gradual process, a process in which three strands ebb and flow: tapas, sattva, and rajas. Excuse me, I said tapas, but I meant to say tamas. And tamasic, and so we can think of happiness within three types and frameworks. Tamas would be sort of sometimes characterized as a dark sort of happiness, like the happiness that secretly laughs when someone that you don't like fails. Happiness that thrives on the unhappiness of someone else. Sort of a dark happiness, a giving in to lower needs. It's also defined as sort of sedent, sort of lazy, passive. Rajas is the happiness that emerges from activity, like doing things in everyday life, the things that each of us are doing right now. And sattvic happiness is an elevated happiness, the happiness that comes of going beyond gratifying pleasures. Like Rajas happiness might be eating a bag of Cheetos. And then there's that little happiness that comes of gratifying that sensory need. But sattvic happiness comes in denying that, and the emergence of discipline, and that much deeper happiness that comes of disciplining oneself. And so here it is written. I had forgotten whether I had put it. So back to this darker happiness, or the darker aspects of each of our personalities. These are the parts of us that are sort of ignorant, delusional, the parts of us that are lazy and sloth-like and sludge-like, the parts of us that might lead us to unethical action, unrighteous. This word compassion doesn't belong here. I wonder if I can mark it out. I can't mark it out, I don't think. Let me see, maybe I can. There we go. Actually, I want to cross it off, not highlight it. So this does not belong. So it's unrighteous, it's fearful. It might have some discrimination or prejudice, those parts of it that exist within all of us. And sometimes, hopefully, don't come to the head very often, but maybe emerge into our thoughts. The parts of us that might feel a desire for greed, or want to be cynical or dubious, or violate others. So these are the dark parts of us that exist, maybe analogous to the shadow parts that Jung talked about. Rajas is about living in this life, taking pleasure in the moment, enduring what emerges for us, taking pride in our work, valor, desire, prowess, expectations, affluence, having resources, being resourceful, using our resources well, adamant. It's all the aspects of living in this physical world, but usually it's involved in it's involved in the physical world and not the spiritual world. Sattvic is these higher values, like contentment as opposed to pleasure, nobility, acting in a noble way as opposed to pride. Equability, here is where compassion belongs. Modesty, sattvic is ethical and restrains oneself, doesn't eat the bag of Cheetos but disciplines the self. Impartial, doesn't take sides, doesn't allow bias. Virtuous, tranquil, forgiving. So these are higher order things. And all of these exist within all of us. And so we choose. We could choose the tamasic path And this might emerge into a personality that you might say is people who get into trouble, people who don't do well, who don't serve society well. We might just linger in this Rajas state and not go up to these higher levels. Or we might get little hints of these sattvic states, and we might then seek to reinforce those states. And so these exist within all of us, they're intertwined. And within that, we choose which path we're going to take. And it's not usually just one. Like, we might really be seeking and nourishing these sattvic characteristics, but then now and again, tamasic things might emerge within us. So it's not a single solitary endeavor. Here's another view of it. We could think of this inertia, this laziness of tamasic states as being down under the ground, and then this really active stage, the growing upward, living in the rajas, living in this world, and then the opening of the lotus flower to the heavens. This might be that sattvic state. So in this content, what I've just offered to you is the background of what we're covering, sort of the nest in which this humanist perspective sits. And we're specifically going to look at Maslow's philosophy and hierarchy of needs, Carl Rogers' philosophy, and the therapeutic aims of his efforts to help people maximize their potential, Erich Fromm's perspective on love and freedom, positive psychology, and happiness.